All right, everyone, welcome back. It's Jim. This is another Raise Game Fully video, and this is another video in my Mystara Revisited series, in which I take a look back at products of the game world that came to be known as Mystara. This is the 5th video in that series, and if you're new to this series, I've been reviewing a series of products called Gazetteers that kind of flesh out the world and explain all kinds of details and personalities and history of the nations of the world. Today's video is about Alfheim, the nation of elves. So everything today is going to be about elves, how they interact with the characters, how they interact with the game world, and their role in the history of the world, which is quite extensive. Before I get into that, I do want to take a quick moment to just thank everybody who tunes into these videos. I just recently hit 300 subscribers, which is amazing. I thank you guys so much for tuning in to listen to what I have to say. So, in my last video, I talked about the Republic of Doroken and its central location in the continent, the western continent of Mystara. And if your party is from Doroken or goes to Doroken, they pretty much can go anywhere in the world from there because of the trade contacts in all the countries that it borders. But as I thought about which country to talk about next, I realized that Alfheim made sense because it's contained within the borders of Doroken. It's just kind of a natural thing to talk about next. So I present to you Gazetteer 5, The Elves of Alfheim. This is written by Steve Perrin. Now, at the beginning of my videos, I usually take a few minutes and tell you about the flavor of the setting to give everybody an idea of just what to expect, what the culture is like a little bit. I feel like I don't have to do that too much with Alfheim because everybody who's involved in Dungeons and Dragons or anybody who's involved in the TTRPG community, even fans of fantasy, whether it's movies or books, everybody kind of knows what elves are. They're forest-dwelling demi-humans. They're about 5 feet tall. They are not Santa's helpers at the North Pole. The elves have a really long history on Mystara, and they've been through many, many dramatic changes to their culture and their history. So I'll try to hit the high points as I talk about the elvish culture. I won't go into all the details just because they've been around for thousands of years, and there's a lot of material in this gazetteer to cover and to dive into. I do just want to mention, as we're going through the product, which was using the old BECMI D&D rules of basic Dungeons and Dragons, elves were a class. They weren't just a race. If you're familiar with advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you might think of elf as your race and your class as something separate, be it a fighter, a magic user, a cleric, or a rogue. In basic D&D, elf was a class. They were fighters and magic users at the same time. So if you're looking at the product closely, or if you're paying attention to the character progression charts with the spells, it is assumed that your elf is a class, a fighter and a magic user. Now these things, of course, can be altered. The rules of basic Dungeons and Dragons and advanced Dungeons and Dragons were similar enough at the time that you could kind of pick and choose which rules you would take from this set. Maybe you wanted to do race and class from one version of the game, or alignment from another part of the game, but they're very, very compatible. Okay, to get back on track, this is the product, Gazetteer 5, The Elves of Alfheim. The cover art is, of course, done by Clyde Caldwell, the artist who does all of the cover art for the Gazetteers. If you were to open the Gazetteer, or the inside cover of the product had some maps. This is a map of Alfheim Town. And as I get into the culture of the elves, we'll talk about how the elves don't really have civilization as humans understand it. There are no cities, there are no towns, there are no paved streets, but the elves have come to realize that interacting with humans is both important and profitable. So they have created kind of a trade hub in their forest, which they have named Alfheim Town, and it shows up on maps as the capital city of the nation, even though it technically isn't. But it's just kind of a community trading hub. So the inside cover of the product has a map of Alfheim Town, And it talks about the different districts as different nationalities and different races have kind of carved out their own districts within the town. This is a close-up of Embassy Row. Embassy Row is a place where ambassadors from different countries kind of gather. It's very close to a marketplace, and it's kind of the hub of Alfheim Town. A lot of adventures take place here, a lot of role-playing can take place here, and it's kind of the home base, if you will, for characters based out of Alfheim Town. The third part of the inside cover of the product shows the Sky City. And what elves do is they live in tree houses, or houses carved into and around the trees. So if you were to climb the trees located in and around Alfheim Town, there is another town essentially above the first town, like up in the tree canopy. And there's a map of it here. It's called Sky City. There's little bridges that connect the trees to each other. And this is where more of the conservative elves kind of hang out. It's just a really, really great design to give it a completely different flavor. Because I think part of the problem when you're playing an elf for the first time is you're not just a short human with a bow and arrow. You know, you're a different race completely. Elves are not humans, and they're very, very different. And I think this Sky City was a really great basic fundamental way to give the impression that, hey, elves live completely differently than humans do. There was a large fold-out map inside the product, and I've kind of broken it down into pieces here for you. This part of the paper map describes a typical home tree, how elves would construct their residences up in the trees. The picture on the left, of course, is a cutaway diagram. The picture to the right is kind of a scale diagram to show the different sizes of the trees compared to ground dwellings. And then the picture at the bottom is kind of a patchwork flow diagram to show you how the walkways would connect tree branches to each other in a typical elven town. This is another section of the large paper map. It's a map of the Kingdom of Alfheim itself. And a couple things about this map. I'm sorry that the image is kind of blurry and hard to read. Alfheim Town is the red city in the left center part of the map. And you see the road leading west out of Alfheim Town, which leads to Drauken City. Other features of the map that are fairly obvious are the black towns on the map. The towns here aren't towns as we perceive them. They're kind of clan holdings. They're kind of the center of the various elven clans. So you wouldn't go to that part of the map and expect to see buildings and taverns and towns, paved roads and signs of civilization. They're more of clan centers. You would see a larger density of tree homes. You would see more traders and things, places to interact with the elves, but they're not towns per se. There are white trees indicated on the map, and there are red skull and crossbones indicated on the map. And these represent areas of the forest that are highly concentrated with positive magical energy and negative magical energy. I'll get into those a little bit later. And of course, there are extensive river networks all throughout the forest. This is due to elvish magic. The elves, as I'll get into in the history, have spent many, many centuries altering the weather to make sure that the forest is adequately watered, and there's all kinds of river runoffs and pools and other features in the forest. So the booklets, there is a player's book. It starts out with what everybody knows about Alfheim, and it follows a design from other gazetteers that I've talked about, in that they have short little interviews with various types of NPCs. So this is tavern rumors from other lands, a conversation with an adventurer. They actually talk to a dwarf to get his opinion on what Alfheim is like. And this is a great way to kind of drop clues to the forest. If your party is coming from another place, or if they're just skirting the forest and they haven't decided whether or not they're going to go in there, they can meet NPCs in a tavern or in a marketplace, and you can drop these rumors there to kind of give them a sense of what Alfheim might be like, especially if you want to steer the party into an adventure in the forest. And these tavern rumors are broken down into different categories, so they would ask about the people, or the land, or towns, how to get rich and famous if you go to Alfheim. And I do want to just read you a little excerpt here. This one is told by a dwarvish adventurer, and anybody who's into fantasy movies or books or gaming knows that dwarves and elves just don't get along. So I thought this was particularly interesting, this tavern rumor, if you will. So the question posed to the dwarf was, tell me about the people. And the response was, the elves are great craftsmen, even if they do work on leather and wood. They are entirely too flighty, though, never stick to a project for very long, always dropping it and not coming back for years. Elven soldiers are too fond of the bow for my taste. You lose the proper fighting edge if you hold your enemy a bow shot away. Sharp axes are the best. That way you know who your foe is and you put yourself in the same danger. It makes you feel alive. So I thought that was great because he's acknowledging their talent, he's acknowledging their skill, but at the same time he's telling you I don't really care for them. I don't like their way of life. It's a little bit too strange for me. But that's just an example of how these tavern rumors can augment your campaign and steer your characters into or out of a certain area. The next section of the player's guide talks about creating and playing an elf character. Now this is pretty self-explanatory to anybody who has read the rulebook. There are rules there inside the rulebook for creating and playing an elf. They're pretty straightforward to anybody who's rolled up a character before. The only thing that's different with Alfheim is you have to pick a clan. And clans are very important to the elves. It's kind of the family unit, if you will. It takes precedent over the family, as a matter of fact. You wouldn't have as strong an allegiance to a father or a mother or a cousin as you would to your clan. The clan is the center of elvish life, and it's very important to have a clan and know what your standing is with the clan. In Alfheim, there are 7 clans, and I'll talk about them a little bit throughout the video. Clan Chosen is the merchant class of the elves. They deal with humans a lot. They're concerned with financing and merchant issues. Arendil is the artisan clan. They're create clothing and ornaments, and anybody who's interested in crafts should seek out someone from the Arendil clan. There's the Theodil clan. These are relatively newcomers to the Forest of Alfheim. They have a history someplace else, which I'll get into in a few minutes, and they're just super eager to prove their worth. They're travelers and wanderers and adventurers, always trying to prove that they belong. There's the Grunelf clan. They are hunters and trackers. There's the Long Runner clan. They're very isolationist. They don't really enjoy interacting with other races, but they've spent their years working on magic, and they have probably the best tree keepers and wizards in Alfheim. There's the Meladil clan, who are historians and writers. They keep the libraries of the history of the elves. And there's the Red Arrow clan, which are traditionally the fiercest warriors of the Forest of Alfheim. This page of the player's book talks about personality quirks. If you want to play some type of a stick to a trope, or maybe your elf wants to be different from the other elves of his clan, it lists some personality quirks here based on the clans I mentioned. It's also a really cool drawing here on this page, whereas each clan has developed their own arrows over the years, and you can see the diagram has different heads and feathers and styles of arrows, which was a really, really cool feature. This page talks about extra skills for the elf. Skills, as I mentioned, were a later addition to basic D&D, and it just gave you some extra skills to flesh out your character. Maybe your character likes to cook or sing or play a musical instrument. And it talks in this section about clan-specific skills. So if you were a historian in one of the clans, you could have a special skill. Or if you were a hunter, you would have special skills based on which clan you chose. And those are extra skills that don't count towards your skill total, which was really, really a neat thing. It kind of draws upon the fact that the elves are so long-lived and they have such a sense of community that an elf adventurer would start the game with extra skills compared to a first-level character in other parts of the world or another race. This here is just a continuation of the skills section. I thought that was a really cool drawing there. All right, that was the player's guide to Alfheim. Now we will get into the Dungeon Master's book. It talks about the various sections of the book. As I mentioned, they're quite long and involved, so it's kind of a directory to tell you, if you're interested in this, go to this section, etc. I did want to show you this page here, and in particular the comment. There's a paragraph or two titled Comments, and I just want to blow this up and show it to everybody because this is a pervasive theme in Dungeons & Dragons, in the products, and to see it spelled out here in the book, it was just really, really cool. Let me read it. Remember that the source book and the other source books have been written for you to use in your campaign in your world, whether it's the official D&D game world or one of your own creation. This means you can and should change things you cannot or do not wish to use before making this a part of your personal game world. From the very beginning of Dungeons & Dragons, the creators have always said, here is what we have decided to include in a nation or a game world or a character class. Take what you want, use what you want, and discard the parts that you don't use. That was really revolutionary. It wasn't like, here are the rules, you have to follow them. It was, we're giving you this material, whatever works for you in your table, in your campaign, on your table, use it and discard the rest. And it was just such a breath of fresh air to have that creative license. You could basically just use a few pieces if you want. And I think that's something that makes the products of Mystara so usable. You can use them as they're presented. You can use them in your own world. If you want to just throw a forest really, really quickly in your campaign world that you've created, you can pick and choose pieces of this product to use. Some people are very involved in world building. They like to build things from the ground up. I personally enjoyed the Gazetteers because it gave me a lot of material right to use right from the get-go, and it allowed me to kind of improv my sessions. I could just use the book. I didn't have to spend hours ahead of time prepping. But the attitudes of the authors was just really, really refreshing to allow everyone to just take what they will and have fun with it. Here is the historical timeline of the nation, and this is, as I mentioned, really involved. I will just kind of go through it shortly. So all Gazetteers are based on the calendar of the Empire of Thyatis, which is a nation I haven't talked about yet, but they have kind of used their civilization and their military might to influence the rest of the world. And their calendar is kind of the common calendar used by all peoples. So the historical timeline here is written in the Phaeacian years. The Gazetteers that I've been talking about in this series are all set in the year 1000, which marks 1,000 years since the crowning of the first emperor of Thyatis. If you can read the small historical timeline text here, you notice that the Elven civilization starts 5,000 years before the crowning of the emperor. So 6,000 years ago is when the Elvish civilization started. And the very basic format of the Elvish history goes like this. They had a home on the other side of the planet, on the southern continent, where everything was idyllic. The elves were taken care of by the forest spirits. And then the humans caused a great disaster. something horrible happened to the planet, which the elves call the Great Rain of Fire. Civilizations were destroyed. The human civilization was completely wiped out, reduced to ashes. The planet itself actually rotated on its axis. So the North Pole and the South Pole weren't the poles anymore. And there were horrible climate changes, and it was pretty much an Armageddon for the elves. So they began this very, very long exodus out of their homeland to try to find a new place to live. The elf that led the nation on this migration was named Ilsendal, and he has since become the patron god or patron immortal of the elvish people. Ilsendal led the elves far across the planet, far up to the north, and the details of the migration aren't important. But he led them to a place called the Sylvan Realm, where they created a new home for themselves. They established a new center for their magic and their tree magic. But there were problems in the Sylvan Realm. The elves found that they were surrounded by humans whom they didn't trust anymore, since they caused the Great Rain of Fire in the first place. So an elf by the name of Mirrodin Starwatcher discovered a secret to traveling a rainbow. And he used the Rainbow Bridge to lead another immigration out of the Sylvan Realm to another place to live. These elves landed in a steppe, a large steppe that was kind of a no man's land. None of the humans wanted to live there. And the elves settled here in this place. They used their magic, their weather magic, their gardening magic, to create a large forest. And this forest became Alfheim. And they've been living here in Alfheim for over 1,000 years. In that time, very, very little has happened. They've interacted with the humans a little bit. There was a war with the humans of Drokkin for a while, but the elves didn't take it too seriously and ended up just kind of beating the Drokkinians into not caring anymore. But since they've lived in Alfheim, very, very little has happened. In that time that they've been here, the Sylvan lands have had their own problems. They were conquered by a wizard, and one of the clans that stayed behind, the Theodils, followed everybody else across the Rainbow Bridge to Alfheim. They're relatively newcomers to Alfheim. I think they've only been here for about 400 years. But that's a quick version of Elvish history. There's so much more that happened through this part of the history, and it ties into some of the secret things that have happened to Mystara, things that have shaped the world on an epic, epic scale. And I don't want to get into those right now because I feel like it will spoil part of the surprise, but it's kind of a hint that the elves know a lot more about the grand history of the planet than the humans do, and they're doing their best to just kind of ignore it or cover it up or hold it together in a certain way. This page here, in addition to having two excellent helmet diagrams, talks about shadow elves. When the Great Rain of Fire happened and destroyed the world, some of the elves from the initial elvish home, fled underground. And they've been living there ever since. These are the basic Dungeons and Dragons equivalent to drow, if you're familiar with dark elves. The shadow elves have been existing underground for thousands of years. They have their own history. I won't get into that because there is a separate product that deals with them. But as of late, within the last 100 years or two, shadow elves have figured out that the world wasn't destroyed, that people and elves are flourishing on the world, and they're taking a great interest in Alfheim, the politics that are happening there, and there are spies here and there throughout the kingdom that kind of give this edgy undercurrent to everything that's happening in Alfheim, knowing that you've got enemy dark elves possibly lurking behind every corner makes for some really great political intrigue. Okay, this section is long, but it's important, and it talks about the Elven Way. And this is a mindset, a philosophy about being an elf. And there's two key concepts that this chapter talks about. The elves believe that the natural state of the world is a forest. And as such, if the world is destined to be forest, the elves are destined to be its caretakers. So their whole way of life stresses living with the forest, ensuring that the forest survives, and not putting too much faith in technology and civilization. Things that the human cultures do, they will move into an area and just consume all the resources to build their civilization. That is nothing like the elven philosophy at all. Elven philosophy recognizes that clearing trees out for homes is important, but there's no real wanton farming of resources to the point where it interferes with your daily life. Another key component of the elven philosophy deals with their long lifespans. Elves are not immortal in basic D&D. They live to about 1,000 years. But even though they do eventually die, they live such a long time, elves are never in a hurry to do anything. And this is reflected in that excerpt I read you from The Dwarven Adventurer. Elves are famous for starting a project and not finishing it. They'll start something, leave it alone for 20 or 30 years, and then maybe come back to it. They're not in a hurry. They have time. They're going to be around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there's no incentive to do something today, tomorrow, or even next year. And it's given the elves this very, very laid-back attitude, which other races have interpreted as laziness. But elves, there's no pressure to do things. There's no pressure to build a city or to get rich quick. There's just nothing in an elf's mind that would do that. Because they're so long-lived and because they're so laid back, they do have attitudes towards some of the shorter-lived races. I touched upon the dwarves earlier. Elves just don't understand dwarves' mentality for hard work and mining. They definitely don't understand humans either. They're often in awe of them because they're so dynamic and explosive, if you will. They're just so quick and irrational and in a hurry to do things. And that's very, very alien to an elf. So they kind of are afraid of humans because they're so unpredictable, but they do realize that they can be very, very good friends and companions. The elves have a much softer opinion of halflings and gnomes. The halflings seem to share a lot of attitudes that the elves have in terms of family and eating and drinking and just having fun. The gnomes too, not to the same extent. The gnomes are craftsmen, which the elves can relate to. The other race mentioned here on this page are orcs. Elves hate orcs. They are mortal enemies. And it's interesting because later on when I get to the character section, I'll talk about an orc who lives in Alfheim Town, but by and large, an elf and an orc would probably kill each other at first sight if they had the chance. The next page talks about paths, and Alfheim is very, very different depending on whether or not your characters are elves, first of all, or if they're Alfheim elves. If you are a visitor to the forest, if you're just there to trade or to see the forest, you're not going to learn a lot about the elves at all. You're not going to be privy to any of this information. You're just a customer. You're just a transient visitor. You want to trade? Fine. Here you go. Have a nice day. If you're an elf, you kind of get some of the things I've been saying about the elven way of life. But if you're an Alfheim elf, everything here takes on a whole new meaning. It's almost like looking behind the curtain, looking behind the stage, and learning all the secrets of a show. If you're an elf from Alfheim, you're going to know so much more about the culture and the history. To that point, there are different paths that Alfheim elves would aspire to in life. One is called the forest path. This is a path that it's kind of a way of life that allows you to just stay home. You stay in the forest, you concentrate on building your clan, hunting, advancing the causes of the clan and the kingdom at large. You just kind of live out your life in your forest, just minding your own business and hunting and spending time with your clan. There is a path called the Wanderer's Path. Wanderers are kind of an enigma in Elvish society. Most people follow the forest path, where you just live a simple life, staying at home, living in the forest. Wanderers want to leave. They want to explore. They want to travel the world. And these are primarily younger elves. Older elves generally don't do this. The parts of the outer world that they've seen don't really impress them all that much, and they really don't want to go back, or don't want to leave, rather. Young elves especially are drawn to the Wanderer's Path, where they leave for a while, maybe visit other places, interact with other races, but it's expected that the Wanderers are going to come home at some point and contribute to the growth of the nation, to the growth of Alfheim as a whole. Not all Wanderers do. Some of them return at regular intervals to just check in on things, maybe keep relations going, and then they leave again. Very often, wandering the world kind of only keeps an elf's interest for so long. Then they return home. Sometimes these wandering elves come home and they want to create a new satellite of their clan. And this is a concept of clan holders. Elves might go and find an unclaimed patch of forest and create a new community for their clan. And it's very often that the Wanderers and the Adventurer Elves do this because they're in a position of leadership, they're more self-sufficient, they're more concerned with creating a clan holding that's in their own image. Maybe they don't subscribe to the old clan holders' point of view, or maybe they want to just create a new home for them and their closest clan members. So the Wanderers are both misunderstood and loved. It's kind of looked upon like an immature, childish thing. Oh, they'll grow out of it. But that is something that is a path in Elvish society. Another path in the Elvish way that elves may follow is a leader's path. And this implies that they would become a clan master or perhaps a tree keeper. Clan masters are probably the political equivalent of a lord, and they rule the clan, they decide policy, they control the military. Tree keepers are clerics. They are very, very involved in magic. There are artifacts throughout Alfheim called Trees of Life that come from Ilsendal himself, and these Trees of Life have magical powers. I'll get into that a little bit later. The tree keepers are kind of the sages of the clans, and each clan has their own tree keepers. This page was interesting because it talks about love and romance, and that kind of ties back into that Wanderer's Path that I talked about. Young elves who decide that they're going to go out and adventure and explore the world are kind of looked upon as like, oh, okay, yeah, you're young, go ahead, get it out of your system. Elves approach relationships in a very similar way. Marriage isn't really a thing in Elvish culture. It's okay to take a partner or to be involved with somebody, but if you're with them for 100 years and then move on to somebody else, that's the norm. There's no lifelong relationships in Elvish culture. This part of the book does talk about relationships with other races. It's very, very trendy or romantic to create a half-elf character. You might want to get into that character's backstory. You know, one parent was an elf, one parent was a human. And I guess some people would look at that and say, oh, it's kind of strange for an elf to be in a relationship with a human because the elf's going to live to be 900 years old and the human's going to live to be 90 years old. But in reality, the amount of time that an elf spends in a relationship with a human isn't any longer or shorter than they would spend in a normal elvish relationship anyway. Elves are used to changing relationships every century or so. It's not a strange thing to an elf. The strange part of it is the child. Like if they do have a half-elf as a child, that child is kind of shunned. They're almost tainted in a way. And I know that as far as character backgrounds, that really makes a really great background to start your career as a half-elf, and you've kind of got this kind of this family attitude about you, which makes for great role-playing. This page was neat. It talks about crime and punishment. There really isn't a set of crimes and laws like you would find in a human society. Anything that involves stealing someone else's property, destroying the forest, destroying buildings, and like just destructive, murderous, aggressive behavior is considered a crime. As far as enforcing the crimes, there's no police force. There are no city guards. Other members of the clan, if someone tears down a building or sets fire to the forest, the clan that's in charge of that building or forest would capture the offender and just simply put him to death. There's just no punishment if you behave in such a way that is destructive or against the Elven way of life. You're considered tainted and not worth it anymore, and you're basically just executed. I thought that was very, 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 very strange. Also on this page is a really, really cool diagram of sword hilts. Kind of like the arrows that I talked about earlier, each clan has a distinctive metalworking style to their weapons. And you can see here the clans have different hilt designs for their swords. So such a really, really great touch to the product. The next section talks about geography and the flora and the habitats that exist within the forest. It's different from the other gazetteers in that there's no town-by-town tour. There's no description of this city and that village and this, that, and the other thing, because there really aren't any settlements. There's Alfheim Town, and then there's the clan centers here and there scattered throughout the forest. So there's really no geography to speak of. This section talks a little bit about tree homes and the houses that are built in there. Talks about villages. They probably have about 30 homes to a village. So the size of a settlement of elves is not that large. This page talks about the clan centers that I mentioned previously. I'll just name them really, really briefly. The Fidiel clan is centered in a village called Fedor. The Longrunner clan lives in a clan center called Pinatel. The Miladil clan lives in Milador. The Chosim clan lives in Desne. Grunolf clan lives in Asen. The Arundel clan lives in Elaromir. Sorry on the pronunciation there. The Red Arrow clan lives in Shield Tree. And these are the black towns that were indicated on the large paper map at the beginning. And it's just a few notes on each one. There's really nothing to describe. It's just a name in case you want to say, oh, I'm from such and such a place. You can use that here in your character's backstory or in your development. Or maybe you can just use the clan center as a setting for an adventure. The end of this page and then the next page also talks about the magic points that I talked about previously. There's good magic points in the forest and there's bad magic points in the forest. They've got some really cool names. It starts out with the good magic points. There's one called Glow Tree, Shadow Down, Mist Haven, Dewdrop. And basically, because of all the elvish magic that's gone into creating the forest, and there's other magics that the immortals have done to the area as well. They're just, the whole land is infused with magic. And the pockets, these magic points or magic pockets, are a direct link to the centuries-old elvish magics that help the forest grow, or in some cases, work against the forest growing. Just to pick an example here, Mist Haven, which is one of the good magic points, is named for the permanent fog that seems to hang in the place. And if you go to Mist Haven, it aids in the casting of spells related to confusion, concealment, teleportation. So they augment spells. Just to look at another one, Dewdrop, for example, augments your detection spells. It'll increase the range or the duration of detection spells. So in ways like this, the elves can set up homes or buildings in the magic areas to control the forest, better patrol the forest, look beyond the forest, and keep an eye on the world at large. This page here talks about the bad magic points. way back in its history, an evil wizard attempted to summon monsters from other places to conquer Alfheim and take it over. And some of his magic has lingered and corrupted some of the magic points, which is possibly where the bad magic points came from. One of them here, just to talk about, is called Thornbush. And it's the oldest documented monster site. Monsters tend to spontaneously appear here. They just kind of teleport in from other places. And very, very often, monsters that get brought in this way end up in one of the rivers. There's an extensive river system that waters the forest, and very, very often monsters end up in the rivers and kind of get washed downstream to a drainage point beyond the forest itself. Most of the water that feeds the forest is magical in nature, and it all gets fed underground through a series of tunnels and dumps out into a large swamp in Drauken, which I mentioned in my last video, the Malfegi Swamp. The place in Alfheim where all these rivers kind of collect and drain is a place called the Sump and Weir. Here is an overview map of it. It's kind of a fortified chasm where the rivers drain into. The reason it's fortified is because any monsters caught in the water river flow kind of get washed here and may attempt to escape. Here's an awesome diagram of the Sump and Weir. You can kind of see the caves where the river feeds into and the grates. This page here has a neat little diagram of a guard team landing a ballista as a monster tries to escape. The bad magic points also have this nasty habit of creating undead. If anybody's killed here or buried near here, the bad magic points have a way of creating ghosts and zombies. So there's always guards posted near the bad magic points just to protect the forest from evil intrusions. Okay, the next section of the DM's book talks about Alfheim Town itself, and this is probably the center of any campaign or any long-running adventure in Alfheim. You're going to go out to the clan centers, you're going to go out on a monster hunt, you're going to go out to various places, but this makes a great home base just because it is the closest thing to a town, it's the closest thing to a human civilization. So you would find things that you would normally expect to find in a town. You would find an inn, or you would find a stable, or you would find a tavern. And I'm not going to get into all the details of Alfheim Town because it's very extensive. It talks about various wards and which races live in those wards, but Alfheim Town is the center of any Alfheim-based campaign. There is a map of Alfheim Town that was on the inside of the product that I talked about. There was also a color version on the paper map that I didn't show everybody, and it's numbered. The numbers, of course, are very, very, very small in my video, but there's an extensive key here in the book that talks about buildings and residences and which stores are located in which district, which of course I won't go into. The next section here deals with the economy. Elves don't really mint coin. They understand that the rest of the world does, and they use coins, and they interact with other races. But away from Alfheim Town, if it's just elves dealing with each other in a more secluded elvish location, they rely on barter. In Alfheim Town, you'll find all the normal money lenders, or you'll find all the exchange currencies that you would expect in a human town. In terms of things that the elves produce, it's basically leather and woodworking, kind of what you would expect. One exception is weapons. But these are not things that you would find traded or sold in Alfheim Town. This is a cool page here. It talks about the elven bows, arrows. Just a basic bow that the elves make for themselves is the equivalent of a magical longbow +1. There are special swords that are made that are, again, magical. There are elven cloaks and boots, which are the very, very common magic items that you would find in the basic rulebook. Elven cloaks, of course, make you virtually invisible outside. Elven boots make you virtually soundless when you walk. But for the most part, elves just trade in in regular old commodities. There is a large section here on politics. There's a lot of interaction between the clans, and without getting into it too much, it boils down to elves are either very, very conservative in that they really don't want to interact with other races. They want to just lock themselves in their forest and let the world just do its thing, let them mind their own business. Or more liberal-oriented elves who realize that interacting with the outside races is important and desirable. You can still be elvish, but interact with the other races. So a lot of the descriptions and roles that are talked about here in the politics section deal with which clans want to remain isolationist and which clans are more open to interacting with other races. There is a king in Alfheim. The current king's name is Dariath. He is not a king that... his power isn't like a king that we would necessarily relate to. He is there to act on behalf of the nation as a whole. The individual clans and the clan masters run their clans. They're independent in that regard. The king is just there to kind of oversee foreign relations. And he's there to be a figurehead to interact with foreign dignitaries, maybe coordinate between the clan masters to make sure information is readily available, but he's not necessarily an autocrat. He's there more of a director to pool resources and just present a united front. There have been only a handful of kings since the founding of Alfheim, and they're usually very, very charismatic adventurer types that people admire, or that the elves realize would present a good personality for outside nations to be drawn to. So the politics of the court just involve things of that nature. There is a section on the military structure of the elves, and it's not an army that we would recognize. All elves are trained in the way of hunting. Hunting is just a part of life for them, and they approach warfare the same way. They kind of are guerrilla tacticians. They would hide and snipe people, and the military is kind of based around this. It's not a presented front of soldiers with heavy armor advancing across a field. They're more of small squads of snipers who would just pick people off from afar, maybe trick them and trap them, change the forest, ensnare them with traps. And that's how the elves approach combat. They just have this hunter's mentality to go out and take out prey. They kind of look at it like a game as opposed to something very, very serious. This page here was really, really cool. It has some standards for the clans. It does give War Machine statistics if you're familiar with the War Machine from the companion rules. All right, the next section of the DM's book deals with personalities. This is really great. It's very extensive. There are over 35 personalities, I believe, here in the personality section. Obviously, I won't go into all of them. Most of them are mid-level NPCs that you would find in Alfheim Town, ambassadors or merchants that you would deal with. For example, the first one that pops up here on this page is Abdullah Hazar Khan, who is a horse merchant from Alaroam. But just to highlight a few personalities here, obviously these are some of the more important ones. On the right is King Dariath. It talks about his history and his clan allegiance. The character in the middle is Sherenglia. She is the king's spy master, and she's very, very well versed in deceptions and acting, and she's a very, very strong supporter of the king. The character on the left is Gilfrondin. Gilfrondin is an old-time friend of the king. He's a general of the Alfheim armies. He's kind of like the general in charge of all of the military operations for defense of the forest. Spoiler side note here, Gilfrondon is actually a shadow elf, and he's a spy for the Shadow Elf Nation, and he's feeding information back to the Shadow Elves about the military capabilities of the elves in the hopes that someday the Shadow Elves can invade. Here's some more character art here. I love this picture of Don Maximilian. It's kind of a nod to the elves from another nation. Some of the elves didn't settle in the Sylvan realm, or they didn't all settle in Alfheim. As the migrations carried them across the world, splinter groups would take off and move and settle into an area here or there, such as the Water Elves in Minrathad. One large group of elves settled in a nation I have not discussed yet, a nation called Glantry. And Don Maximilian here is either descended from Glantrian elves, or he himself is a Glantrian elf. And I just love the caricature here with the mustache and the beard. I didn't know that elves could have beards when I first started playing. I thought they were all incapable of growing them, but these Glantrian elves seem to be an exception, which is really, really cool. There are, of course, a lot more characters. As I mentioned, there's humans and orcs and other elves. They talk about all the clan leaders and their personalities. I'm not going to get into them. They basically fall into the descriptions of isolationist mentalities versus non-isolationist mentalities that I mentioned earlier. This section here talks about the secrets of the elves, and these aren't secrets to do with the history that I mentioned and how the elves interacted with humans over the centuries. These are magical secrets that they use to craft special items, such as the boots and the swords. It does list the spells here that are available to elves from Alfheim as in their character development process. This here is, of course, an experience point table copied from the basic or expert rulebook. In basic Dungeons and Dragons, elves are limited to 10th level of experience, but don't forget they are magic users and fighters at the same time. So a 10th level elf is essentially a 20th level character. It doesn't quite work out evenly, but a 10th level elf is far more powerful than it appears. One thing that is explained here in the Secrets of the Elves section is that elves can advance beyond 10th level in terms of magic use. So if you notice, the title of the experience point table is Elf Magic. By spending time with tree keepers and by spending time with elven mages, elves can continue to progress beyond 10th level in magic use only. They would still fight as a 10th level elf as far as saving throws or hit points or attacks, but they would progress with their spell casting ability. If you are familiar with the Rule Cyclopedia or the companion and master level basic rule books, Beckme rule books rather, elves do have opportunities to progress in fighting technique by spending time with humans. They're given these things called attack ranks. So you could be a 10th level elf and you could be attack rank C or attack rank D, which would be the equivalent of a higher level fighter. And it basically gives you more combat abilities, possibly more better saving throws. But in the Gazetteer here, it's all about magic use. And as you can see, progressing up to a level 20 gives an elf quite a lot of spells. And that's pretty on par with a human wizard. It talks about different spells that aren't listed in the rule books, which is kind of cool. It would give your elf from Alfheim a completely different spell to throw out in the middle of an adventure, kind of giving them a unique flavor. It talks about the trees of life and the special clerical powers that a tree of life bestows upon the tree keeper. That's really, really cool. There's a lot more details on these things in the Rule Cyclopedia or in the companion rulebook. Talks about Elven, about the trees of life and the things that you can do with them. There's an interesting section here on use names. This is something that's unique to Alfheim. It basically removes, it's a magical ceremony where you remove yourself from your clan and you're given a magical name. And it protects you by having a use name, it protects you from charm and hold spells as long as your opponent doesn't know your use name. You would have to invoke someone's use name to have them affected by this magic. It was kind of a neat little quirky thing that is particular to the Elves of Alfheim. Another cool thing here in the secret section, this column called the Secret Visitors, which talks about a herd of unicorns that befriended the elves a long time ago and agreed to breed with the elvish horses to create a species that is called the Elven Horse, and how they are much more intelligent and they are more in tune with the elves' way of the forest. I thought that was really cool, how the unicorns have a special relationship with the elves in Alfheim. This has a little column here that talks about half-elves. I mentioned them earlier about how they're kind of neither elves nor humans and they face a lot of discrimination. A neat little map here of a typical tavern that you would find in Alfheim Town, in case you needed to just throw that up into your campaign really quickly. And then this section here talks about campaigning in Alfheim. This talks about some of the things I mentioned earlier, how a campaign would be very different if you were just visiting or if Alfheim was your home. And it talks about clan rivalries, which clans get along with which other clans, how much of that you want to include in your campaign. Do you really want to have political arguments between different clans? Do you want to present a more unified front? It's up to you. But the ingredients are here to create those clan rivalries if you wish. There's a section on monsters, and most of them are similar to the monsters you would find in the rulebooks. I did want to mention this one in particular because I think it's really, really cool. There's a creature called a Wyrd, W-Y-R-D, and it's basically an undead spirit that has possessed the body of an elf. It's something super creepy. I don't know how to describe it. The picture here does a really good job. It reminds me of some type of Japanese ghost or Japanese vampire, but the bad magic spots around the forest contribute to the creation of these words. And it's just a really cool idea to give Alfheim campaign its own flavor, its own setting. There is a great section on adventures. There are several cool adventures in the Gazetteer. I'm not going to talk about all of them. One of them, the first one here is really, really cool. It involves King Dariath, actually, who goes out on a hunt, and he's attacked by this monster in the forest, which kills his horse. And then there's an assassination plot. These assassins follow him into the forest and try to dispose of him, and the party has to decide one way or the other if they're going to help him or hurt him. There's a great drawing here from the adventure. Another one of the adventures that's really, really cool involves this orc who lives in Alfheim Town. His name is Urgum, and he's an orc who's living in Alfheim under the premise of orcs are misunderstood, they're not bad, they're not evil. But in this adventure, he's completely lying. He's trying to destabilize the government, and he's working with foreign spies to do all kinds of evil things. The third adventure that I just want to talk about briefly involves an egg. The party is helping someone recover a stolen egg. It doesn't seem that important at the time, but they track down this egg just as it hatches, and it turns out to be a phoenix. And the phoenix, of course, is confused. It doesn't know what's going on, and it's inadvertently sets the buildings, the town on fire. And the party has to both put out the fire, save the inhabitants, and at the same time recapture the phoenix, which I thought was a really, really cool concept for an adventure. There are other adventures, there are other characters. There's so much in this Gazetteer, and of course I'm not going to get to all of it, but that was it. That was Gazetteer 5, the Elves of Alfheim. It fits perfectly in Mystara, of course, but if you want to take pieces and put it in your own campaign world to just give your own Elvish home a bit of flavor, by all means, that would be fantastic. But that is all for today. I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. I hope to make some more videos soon. One final side note, if you are in the New England area, if you're headed to PAX East this coming weekend, I will be there. The gang from Ray's Gamefully will be there. We'll be there on Friday. If you're there, if you see us, say hi. Check us out. Just tell us that you've seen us and that you love D&D and you love Mystara. And as always, please be kind to your fellow players. Thank you so much.